Thermal putty. Are there any benefits, and is it worth the mess? Let's check it out today. So today we're going to take a peek at some thermal putty. And not just that, we've installed a water block on a 4080 Super and used an EK Vector2 block. Yes, this isn't a 50 series GPU video. I know it's shocking. We do have some decent 40 series cards yet to review and to play with. So what we're going to look at here is, obviously this is enthusiast work at your own risk, but the install video has already been out there on the channel. This GPU runs really well. Now it's time to look to see what kind of performance gains we can get by adding a water block to this. Now this is going to go on the test bench, and you can see here in the picture, this is the 4080 Super with the block installed. It is the i9-14900K, gigabyte board, 32 gig of memory. One of the interesting things is, and we'll get to this here, the path that your water takes is also important to consider. And that'll become evident here as we get through this data. So getting right into this and get started here. So look at the performance information. I've combined your synthetic benchmarks from performance and productivity all in one table. I'm not messing around. Okay, so but what I've also done that you might find interesting is here in the first column it says air score. This is the OEM cooler as I got the GPU. So from as far as I know, when I was opening this card up for new pads, new paste, I don't think this card's ever been opened up. And I didn't chance it, didn't mess with it. I put it in the system and I ran all the benchmarks as is. And then you saw where I did a new Repad and Repaste with the OEM cooler. And so then that is the refreshed air score, okay? And I didn't run all of the tests. I just ran, some of them, just to try to get an idea. Does it do better or not? How well? I was basically running it to make sure that I got good contact and it ran well, and it did. So then, now the orange column is the Waterblock score. So here you have left alone, untouched old pad and paste, new pad and paste with the air cooler and the Waterblock. And what's the change from when I got it to putting the Waterblock on it? What's my uplift or decrease in performance, if you will? So what you can see is less than 1% improvement from going from the stock air cooler to the Waterblock. And that's not as much as other cards that I've put together you've seen on the channel. I've done several Waterblock installation videos. This is probably the smallest uptick in performance that I've seen, if I remember correctly. But look across the board, it's basically no difference, which that's not a bad thing. That just means the card runs really well, whether it's on the air cooler or has a water block. What about the CPU temperature? So these shouldn't be much different, and they're about the same average, 67, 66. So okay, margin of error here. What about when you put the water block on it and run it into your custom loop, because it is a water-cooled CPU, and now water-cooled CPU and GPU with the new Waterblock installation, and we see the CPU temp does go up by about 8.7%, and that would seem, wow, that's counterproductive. Something's not working well, but I beg to differ. I think that means that the GPU is throwing heat, and this is where your loop, the importance of your water path, can come into play. Now, in my main rig, that it's really just an overblown setup with two huge radiators, and it's redundant pumps, but I've got, pump to a CPU and the SSDs to a radiator, and then out to the GPU and memory, and then to a radiator. So like I've separated the CPU and the GPU with radiator runs to try to cool any heat that got thrown into the water from those bigger components. In this situation, that's not the case. The test bench is like sort of the bare bones. Most people would probably run a 360 millimeter radiator, and that's how I've set this up with standard fan speeds, standard pump spinning, water flow, and what temperatures do you get. Like if you've gone back and seen any of my keeping it cool, it was a much better controlled looking at water temps and delta and comparing to standardized water temps. Here we're just sort of taking a broader look at this, but in this situation my loop runs from the pump to the GPU first, then to the CPU, and then back to the radiator. So the CPU is seeing the heat, the water picked up, and then it has to cool the CPU second before getting a reprieve to be cooled off in the radiator. And I think you can take notes with this. I think that has a lot to do with it. I could, in theory, try to flip my flow around and rerun a bunch of tubing. It's really a pain in the butt. But I mean, I could play with this theory, but if you think about it, it's pretty consistent. And that's also the same as if you've watched my 5090 video with the heat that got thrown into the loop. It did bump my CPU temperatures. That didn't mean that my CPU block doesn't do well. That just highlights the importance of good hardware. If you get a good piece of hardware that helps to throw the heat away, your other hardware also has to be able to pick up the slack. And I have two really good CPU blocks here, the Optimus Signature V3, as well as the Thermal Grizzly Direct Die Mate, or the Direct Die Pro block. So those are two top performing CPU blocks in my test. And you still see a little bit of a bump in temperature. So if I had a lesser block in there, I would imagine that it would probably even be higher. But these two are very top performing blocks and still had some headroom to handle the heat, and it's still into the low 70s, so that's okay. What about the GPU temperature comparison then? So the GPU was throwing a bunch of heat, right? We got in the 60s, the average of 57, 53 with the new pad and paste, and then down to 45, which was a 20% reduction. And this is excellent cooling performance. But if you've paid attention to the 5090, the 5070 Ti, the 3090, I did the 3080 Founders, I have the 3080 12 gig that's water blocked. If you go back and look at those percentages, they were a little higher in percentages. So we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a minute. So that's the GPU temperature. What about the GPU memory junction temperature? Started at about 60, and new pad and paste was 61. So we've averaged about the same. We really didn't get much benefit in the memory temps. And I think that the OEM coolers pads were doing okay. Repasting the die was probably okay as well. But overall, the card was doing decently well with the air cooler, but it did drop down to 43.25 degrees and another almost 30%. And these are great numbers of drops in performance. Now, the 40 series still has the hotspot that you can use, and the 50 series, we've lost that, right? But we were around 63, 64 degrees with the air cooler, dropped down to about 54 degrees for a 14 or 15% reduction in the temperatures. And again, everything's going to run cooler with your water block. You know, this is old hat now, right? Everyone sort of knows where this is going. What about your power consumption? 248, 242, and then down to 238. So you had a 4% reduction in your temps to maintain the same performance, and yet could have that much better cooling on the GPU die as well as the memory. What about productivity with Puget Bench? This is comparable to what we saw with the 5090. It was less than a 0.5% increase. So really that's a wash, right? Like my performance benchmarks were a wash. The performance of Puget Bench for the standard score is kind of a wash. And it was, I mean, look at your extended score. It was even slower. So for what that's worth, I think that standard of error, that's pretty much no change. Your card is just going to run cooler if you do something like this. So in summary, you got basically little to no performance uplift. You did get a bump in your CPU temperatures thanks to the orientation of the loop. The GPU, die, memory hotspot were all dropped, as well as your power consumption had a reduction. So what is the summary here? And I think these are interesting results and a little bit different than the 50 series performance that we've had on the channel, as well as the 3090 block. 3090 was an active backplate as well. And what we see here is that the Waterblock still had a significant improvement over the stock air cooler. But I want to pause for a second and give ASUS some credit. I think that the OEM cooler in this ASUS card is an excellent cooler. We didn't see high 30s to low 40% reductions in temperatures like some of the other cards. We saw in the 20s to mid 20s, like mid to high 20% reduction in temperatures from the memory. And I think that that's not a testament to how poorly Putty did. I think that's a testament to how good the OEM cooler from ASUS is. Does it justify the the obnoxious price for the Astral? I don't know. I'm not pushing overclocking and doing that. They have some really nice technology and designs. I would love to work with them more in the future. I think they have an excellent product, and I will give them tip of the cap to having a really good air cooler, because I think it showed even here with this 4080 Super. And it does give you a little bit more watts in savings, and the performance is still there. And again, I think the CPU went up in temperature because the GPU block was so efficient at pulling the heat that it heated the water, and then you had hot, warmer water to cool the CPU, and your temperatures would go up. Just like if your ambient temperature in your room goes up, the whole system and everything goes up the same amount. So I think that's what you're seeing there, not as an inefficiency of the blocks per se, but just you threw hotter water at the device. So with that, I think adding a water block, you see this coming a mile away, from my standpoint, is still worth it. Your cards run cooler. It protects your hardware. You get at least the same performance, if not a little bit of performance boost, as we've seen in some of the other cards. But in this situation, you don't really get a performance boost. I think this card's running right where it needs to run, and it's going to stay cool. And again, if this was going to be the main card, obviously I've got a 5090 in my main rig now, but if this was going to be the main card, I would take it back apart and clean up the putty that you could see. So I'm not a huge fan of the putty. You could see it was quite the mess. I think in order to really get a great idea of how much better putty is, if it's worth it or not, is I'm going to have to use putty on an air cooler, or use pads on a water block and then go to putty. But you got to limit your variables here. So it's not a fair assessment to say, look how much putty did, how much better putty did than pads, because they were two different cooling mechanisms. So that's not what the goal here was. The goal was, let's try my hand at the thermal putty, just in case I had a block that may not have fit just perfect, or wasn't just getting my pads just right. Let's check out the putty performance. And I'm sure that putty is really nice. I don't have complaints from its performance standpoint. But my goodness, I can't imagine going back and cleaning that mess up. That's that's going to be a lot if I open that card up again. So much so that I wouldn't want to clean up the putty mess that you see. I would be more willing to take the acrylic cover off the water block just to get just to keep the card mounted to the PCB and clean up around the card and then reseal the water block. That's what I would probably do, is to just not have to mess with that putty again, because it's working really well. It's just a mess. It took a long time to put this card together compared to just putting thermal pads on the card. But be that as you may, I haven't signed off Putty, but then I'm not excited to use it for the next project either. So you be the judge. Try it for yourself. See what you think. I did get some advice on Reddit that I'd forgotten about maybe loading a syringe. You know, cutting a syringe really high and using the syringe to get a nice even bead. And that might have been much more neater way to apply the putty. And if I do putty again, I'm going to do the syringe route, because a Thermal Grizzly product, I was expecting it to be more firm and set up better and be easier to work with. And because when you were pulling it off your glove, the place where you're pulling it from was instantly getting thinner and changing shape, and you couldn't hold it together in the measured thickness you wanted and set it down on. It was too thin. So that tells me that it probably would have done well for the syringe. I just totally forgot about that technique until it's all over with. So with that, I think there's some points to ponder here. Hopefully you found this information interesting. I'll get this right out to you as soon as I possibly can. More coming on the way. Stay safe. God bless.